Hello and welcome back. Today and for the next few couple of sets of notes, we're going to be really breaking down the macromolecules. Today is very clearly about carbohydrates and lipids, but we will have our own couple sets of notes about proteins and then nucleic acids as well. So this is sort of a good overview about the specificity that is expected for you to know about carbs and lipids. I know it's going to seem like a lot, but some of this you probably already know just from living in the world. You have been exposed to carbs and lipids plenty. So let's give ourselves some working definitions of what we consider lipids and carbs and what their purposes are. So for lipids, that's like your typical fats, butters, oils, stuff like that. This is your primary long-term energy storage compound. Long-term energy means that you can keep it for months, years, right? Long term. This is not something that gets used the same day that you eat it. It contains 2 times the amount of energy per unit as a carbohydrate or a protein, which means that it is a much more high-powered energy than carbs or proteins. The carbon-hydrogen bonds in fatty acids are super stable, which is why they yield so much energy when they're broken. And they're insoluble in water, right? We know that oil and water don't mix, which means that they're harder to transport. So once they are wherever they are, they tend to stay there. Now, carbohydrates, on the other hand, that's like your sugars. That's like your bread, your rice, fruit sugars are carbs as well. So this is short-term energy storage. This is something that you eat and then can use within hours. It's easily digested, so the energy is released quickly. It's stored as glycogen in muscles and the liver in animals. So this can quickly be turned into and used as blood sugar, which allows the sugar to transport very quickly around the rest of your body. And then simple carbs like mono and disaccharides are more soluble in water, like blood, so they're easily transportable. Now we're going to focus on lipids first, especially fats. We're going to talk about coronary artery disease and coronary heart disease. This is basically when you have fat deposits that are building up in arteries. So an excessive intake of fat is strongly correlated to an increase in blood pressure, atherosclerosis, and coronary heart disease. We've been studying this for decades at this point. So these fat deposits will develop in arteries. You can see it right here, this sort of like yellow fat deposit. And when it does develop, you reduce the diameter of the lumen, and the lumen is like the opening of the artery. And when you reduce that, obviously you're reducing the amount of blood that can flow through that. Eventually, this can lead to clots and heart attacks. When you have this buildup of this plaque, it makes moving blood throughout the body a much more tiresome activity, and it makes it much more difficult to get blood to everywhere that it needs to go in your body. So a positive correlation has been found between saturated fatty acid intake and rates of this coronary heart disease, but please remember that correlation is not proof. Correlation does not equal causation, but it is a pretty positive correlation that has been studied for years. Now I say saturated fatty acid, there is also unsaturated fatty acid. And what does all that mean? Well, let's talk about it. So we have different types of fatty acid. There's saturated versus unsaturated. Saturated means that every single carbon has a hydrogen attached to it. Do you see how in this top one right here, every single carbon has a hydrogen, there are no openings? That means saturated. Unsaturated means that there are openings, right? Carbons are double bonded instead, so there's not a hydrogen attached to every single one, okay? So we have unsaturated, meaning that that not every carbon has a hydrogen, and then saturated. Within unsaturated fatty acid, there's also cis fats and trans fats, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. But where do these types of fatty acids come from? Well, they're like your typical fats and oils and all of that. So animal fats, butter, milk, cheese, that's a saturated fatty acid. It can lead to coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, but it's not the worst type of fat. You just want to eat it in moderation. And then within the unsaturated fatty acids, cis fats are better for you than trans fats. And if you've ever heard this in like on the news or in like magazines that like no trans fat in this whatever it is. It was like a big diet fad. Like, I mean, it still sort of is, but it was like massive in the 2000s and the 90s. And it was like when they were discovering that trans fat was like really bad. So anyways, it was like, you can probably, if you look at like magazines at the grocery store checkout, sometimes you still see like eliminate trans fat from your diets, like stuff like that. Cis fats are like your vegetable oils, like olive oil, fish oils. They have a lot of omega-3s linked to brain development. These are the best types of lipids that you can be consuming, whereas trans fats are like hydrogenated vegetable oil and margarine, sort of like man-made stuff. These are the worst lipids you can have. They have strong links to heart disease, strong links to fatty acid buildups in your arteries. If given the option, you want to steer clear of them. Now, I was saying cis and trans fat, but what does that actually mean? So the definition of the prefix cis means same side, and the definition of the prefix trans means opposite sides. And you can actually see that up here. So when I say cis, I mean that the hydrogens are on the same side, right? They're both on the top, whereas this trans fatty acid has opposite side hydrogens, so they're one on top, one on the bottom. Okay? So when I have a cis fatty acid, you see this bend. Okay? But with this trans fatty acid, it doesn't bend. So some pretty important structural features there. So cis unsaturated fatty acid, that's like olive oil, like I was saying. It's really popular in Mediterranean countries. Think like Greece, Italy, Turkey, like those types of countries. And if you look even closer, those populations have low rates of heart disease. Is there a correlation? Maybe. Could it be due to genetic factors? Maybe. Other foods? Sure. But this does play a role, and we can't discount its role in their diet. Whereas trans unsaturated fatty acid, like I said, positive correlation. Patients who have died from coronary heart disease have fatty deposits in arteries. Patients who have that are found to have high concentrations of trans fat. So again, there is this positive correlation between trans fat and heart disease. So again, just talking briefly about structure, trans fatty acids have a higher melting point, they're straight, and they're solid at room temperature, whereas cis fatty acids are bent and liquid at room temperature. And again, you've seen this. You've seen sunflower oil. Wow, that is like a very obscure example, I'm sorry. You've seen olive oil for sure, but any type of like vegetable oil is typically a cis fatty acid. Now, in general, lipids are composed of glycerol and fatty acids. We talked about that in our last set of notes. Fatty acids are just long chains of hydrocarbons, and we've talked about what saturated and unsaturated mean, but there are multiple types of all of that, because of course there is. So we briefly talked about this, but now you have a definition you can write down. So saturated fatty acid is all carbons in this molecule are carrying as many hydrogens as possible. The carbons are saturated. If you've ever heard the term saturated in any other capacity, it means the same thing, right? They're to their capacity. They cannot carry anymore. They have all the hydrogens they could possibly carry. They are saturated. Monounsaturated is one double bond exists, so two empty hydrogen spots, and you can see that here, right? One double bond, and so we're missing these two hydrogens. Whereas polyunsaturated is at least two double bonds, typically come from plants, and they are, so lots of double bonds, not as many hydrogens. You saw this in an image earlier in the notes. But again, a polyunsaturated fatty acid would be like olive oil. And our basic functions, we have structure, right? Phospholipids are the main component of the cell membrane. We talked about that in chapter 1. Hormonal signaling, so steroids are actually lipids. So estrogen, testosterone, these typical hormonal signaling molecules that are involved in our body in a number of different ways are lipids. Insulation, right? They serve as heat insulators. The myelin sheath of neurons serve as electrical insulators, so they not just for warmth but also for like electrical impulses. Protection, this can form, like you have fat form a tissue layer around your key internal organs. That's why you have like fat around your abdominal cavity, because it provides protection. And then storage of energy, again, this is like what we talked about this whole time, long-term energy storage. Now, we're going to spend significantly less time on carbs, but a few slides on carbs. There are monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides, but you should be aware of these examples of carbs. So monosaccharides mean that there is one carbon ring. You have glucose, which is like our favorite, right? Glucose is used in everything, used for energy, building block of carbohydrates. Galactose, which is part of lactose, which is what we'll talk about in a second, and then fructose, which is the fruit sugar. So found in fruits and sweet roots, like honey, found in onions. I know you're probably like, onions aren't sweet. Well, they can be. Vidalia onions are sweet. And then disaccharides, they have two carbon rings, so lactose is the milk sugar. Maltose is composed of two glucoses. This is used in seeds, so when we get to talking about plants, we'll talk about maltose more. And then sucrose is probably the most prevalent disaccharide. Sucrose is like your table sugar, used by plants to transport. It's like really popular. And then polysaccharides. So these are the multiple ringed sugars. They can be straight or branch chains, but they are multiple sugars, more than two. Most common polysaccharides are composed entirely of glucose, just glucoses one after another. Can serve as energy storage. I mean, hello, all of the carbs and lipids, energy 101, right? And examples of polysaccharides are starches, which can be used by plants to store like extra glucose, stored in plastids and bacteria and chloroplasts, broken down by animal enzymes in digestion, right? We eat starches all the time. Think like potatoes, some breads, right? Cellulose, that composes cell walls in plant cells, so very strong, indigestible by most organisms, but still necessary. And then glycogen is used by animals to store surplus glucose, short-term storage of energy though. And then last but not least, unfortunately we do have to talk about this. IB does require it. It's not a great test, so if you ever do take your BMI, I hope that you realize that this number is not the end-all be-all of like who you are as a person, but I do have to teach you what BMI is. So BMI is the body mass index, and it indicates a person's relative weight versus height. So to calculate a BMI, you take your mass, which is like your weight, in kilograms and divide it by your height in meters squared. And by doing that, you can land yourself on this relatively arbitrary scale. You'll notice that I do not have a strong opinion about a BMI because it has changed as the healthcare profession has changed. So it's very arbitrary. And based on where you fall within those numbers, it gives you a status of whether underweight, a quote-unquote normal weight, and whether you're overweight or considered medically obese. And so, again, this is a very arbitrary scale. If you ever take your BMI, I hope that you take it with a grain of salt. And there's like way better ways to determine whether you're a healthy individual than this particular number. But please be aware of how to calculate this, because there will most likely be a question about how to calculate a BMI on a test or a quiz. All right, great job. I'll see you next time.